sold into slavery by her own family, alien girl found love with the human that saved her. The auction floor stank of ozone and desperation. Elias kept his head down as the crowd pressed close around the raised platform, bodies packed shoulder to shoulder in the dim belly of Station Hecate's cargo bay. Sweat and recycled air made breathing feel like work. The auctioneer's voice crackled through overhead speakers, sharp and mechanical, listing specifications like she was selling engine parts instead of people. He shouldn't have come. Every instinct told him to turn around, push back through the throng of miners and traders, and pretend he'd never seen the posting on the station's gray market feed. But his hands stayed shoved deep in his jacket pockets, jaw tight, as the next lot was dragged onto the platform. She moved like water, even with the restraints. The Velari woman's wrists were bound in front of her, connected by a dull metal chain that clinked softly with each step. Her skin glowed faint blue in the harsh overhead lighting, bioluminescent patterns tracing lines beneath the surface like living circuitry. Those markings pulsed slow and dim, barely visible, as though her body was trying to disappear. Coral pink hair fell past her shoulders in waves, threaded with golden ornaments that caught the light and held it. Her ears, white-furred, tipped with vivid blue, swiveled constantly, tracking sounds from all directions, despite the way she held her body perfectly still. The crowd surged forward, someone whistled. Elias felt his jaw clench harder. Her eyes swept across the auction floor, amber gold with vertical pupils that reflected the platform lights like mirrors. She didn't flinch when the auctioneer grabbed her shoulder and turned her in a slow circle, displaying her like merchandise. Her expression remained smooth, controlled, but Elias saw the way her ears flattened back against her skull for just a moment before snapping upright again. That single gesture hit him like a kick to the chest. He knew what it looked like when someone was trying not to break. The bidding started at 15,000 credits. A mining foreman near the front raised his hand immediately, grinning at his companions. Elias watched the Velari woman's luminescent markings dim further, fading toward gray. Her fingers curled against the chain between her wrists. 20,000. 25. The numbers climbed while Elias stood frozen, his sister's face flashing through his mind. The way she'd looked at him that last time before the mine shaft collapsed, trusting him to get them both out. He hadn't. She'd died in the dark while he'd crawled toward the surface alone, and for 8 years he'd lived with the weight of that failure pressing down on his lungs. 30,000 credits, going once. Elias's hand shot up before he could think it through. The auctioneer's gaze snapped to him, calculating. Several heads turned. The mining foreman scowled and raised his bid. Elias matched it without hesitation, his heart hammering against his ribs. On the platform, the Velari woman's eyes found his through the crowd. Her ears swiveled forward, focused entirely on him, and he saw something flicker across her face. Confusion, maybe, or the faintest edge of hope. The bidding spiraled. Elias felt his savings evaporating with each raise, every credit he'd scraped together from cargo runs and salvage jobs, burning away for a woman whose name he didn't even know. The foreman cursed and dropped out. A trader in the back pushed the price higher. Elias matched him. 42,000 credits, going once, going twice. Silence fell like a held breath. The gavel came down. Elias pushed through the crowd before his brain could catch up with what he'd just done. The transaction processed through his wrist terminal with a soft chime that felt obscene. A station enforcer unlocked the Velari woman's restraints with mechanical efficiency and shoved her toward him. She stumbled slightly, then caught herself with that same fluid grace, rubbing her wrists where the metal had left red marks against her luminous skin. Up close, she was even more striking. The bioluminescent patterns traced delicate lines along her collarbones, down her arms, across the high planes of her cheekbones. Her scent hit him, something floral and unfamiliar, cut with the metallic tang of fear. Her ears angled toward him, trembling faintly, while her amber eyes studied his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "Can you walk?" His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. She nodded once. The golden chains woven through her hair chimed softly with the movement. Elias turned and walked. She followed without hesitation, her footsteps silent against the cargo bay floor. He felt hyper-aware of her presence behind him, the way she moved, the faint glow of her skin illuminating the shadows, the soft rustle of fabric against her legs. Station security didn't stop them. No one ever stopped you when you had a bill of sale. His ship waited in Docking Bay 7, a battered Sparrow-class freighter that had seen better decades. The hull was patched in 3 places with mismatched plating, and the boarding ramp groaned when he triggered the release. Home, for what it was worth. The Veilari woman paused at the base of the ramp, her ears swiveling as she scanned the bay. Checking for threats or planning an escape, Elias couldn't tell which. Her markings pulsed brighter for a moment, then dimmed again as she turned to face him. "Why?" Her voice was quiet, melodic, with an accent that made the single word sound like a song. Elias met her eyes. He could still feel his heart racing, adrenaline singing through his veins now that the moment had caught up with him. He'd just spent everything he had on a stranger, on principle, on ghosts. "Because nobody should be on that platform," he said. She studied him for a long moment, her ears tilting forward in what might have been curiosity or disbelief. Then she climbed the ramp, her movements careful and deliberate, and disappeared into the ship's interior. Elias exhaled slowly and followed her inside. The cargo hold smelled like engine grease and recycled air, familiar in a way that usually brought him comfort. Now it just felt inadequate, cramped and worn, and nothing like what someone deserved after being dragged through an auction like livestock. The Veilari woman stood in the center of the hold, turning slowly to take in the stacked crates and exposed conduits. Her ears tracked every sound, the hum of the life support, the distant clank of station mechanics, his breathing behind her. When she completed her circle and faced him again, her luminescent patterns had brightened slightly, casting faint blue light across the metal walls. "What happens now?" she asked. Elias felt the weight of the question settle over him. He'd rescued her, spent everything, hadn't thought past getting her off that platform and away from hands that would have used her for profit or pleasure, or both. Now she stood in his ship, free but not safe, and he had no plan beyond the next jump. "Now we get the hell out of here," he said, "before someone realizes what I just did." Her ears lifted higher, and for the first time since he'd seen her on that platform, something almost like relief crossed her face. She nodded once, sharp and decisive, and Elias turned toward the cockpit, his hands already reaching for the pre-flight sequence he could perform in his sleep. Behind him, he heard her whisper something in a language he didn't understand. A prayer, or a curse, or maybe just her own name, spoken to remind herself she was still real. The engines came to life with a shudder that rattled through the deck plating. Elias strapped into the pilot's seat and began the launch sequence, his fingers moving across controls worn smooth from years of use. In the co-pilot seat beside him, the Veilari woman sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes fixed on the viewport as Station Hecate fell away behind them. Neither of them spoke as the stars opened up ahead, cold and infinite and utterly indifferent to what they'd just begun. The jump took 3 hours. Elias kept his attention split between the navigation display and the woman beside him. She hadn't moved since they'd left Station Hecate, her posture rigid in the co-pilot seat, hands still folded in her lap. Her bioluminescent markings pulsed in slow, uneven rhythms that he was starting to recognize as stress. The golden ornaments in her hair caught the cockpit's instrument glow, turning them into small points of fire against the coral pink waves. He cleared his throat. She didn't react. "There's water in the galley," he said. "Food stores aren't much, but there's enough." Her ears swiveled toward him, while her eyes remained fixed on the viewport. After a moment, she spoke without turning her head. "What is your name?" "Svarn." "Elias," she repeated, testing the syllables. Her accent softened the edges. "I am Senna." The name suited her, simple, elegant, carrying weight without explanation. Elias nodded, unsure what else to say. Small talk felt absurd after buying someone's freedom with his last credit. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the ship's ambient hum and the occasional ping from the navigation system. "Where are we going?" Senna asked. Station drift, outer rim. No questions asked, no records kept. He adjusted their trajectory slightly, compensating for gravitational drag from a nearby moon. I know someone there who can forge documents. Get you passage somewhere safe. Her ears flattened back against her skull. The movement was so swift and definitive that Elias glanced over, startled. Her luminescent markings dimmed to barely there flickers beneath her skin. I have no safe place, she said quietly. Elias wanted to argue, to offer reassurances that would probably sound hollow, but something in her tone stopped him. He'd heard that particular emptiness before. In his own voice, in the dark months after the collapse, when well-meaning people told him he'd heal, move on, find peace. Some losses didn't leave room for comfort. Then we figure out a next step, he said instead, one that's yours. Senna turned to look at him finally, her amber eyes catching the light and reflecting it back like burnished metal. Her gaze held his for several heartbeats, searching for something he couldn't name. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, because her ears lifted slightly and her markings brightened just enough to cast faint blue light across the console between them. Why did you spend everything? She asked. You saw the bill of sale? I felt your panic when the transaction cleared, your regret. She touched her fingertips to her sternum. Velari sense emotional resonance. We are empathic. It is why we are valued by some and feared by others. Elias processed that information, his stomach twisting slightly at the thought that she'd been feeling his emotional chaos since the auction floor. Every spike of adrenaline, every flash of guilt and reckless determination. She'd carried that alongside her own terror. I'm sorry, he said. That must have been overwhelming. It was. Senna's fingers traced absent patterns against the armrest, but it was also the first time since my family sold me that I felt anything other than fear or shame. Your emotions were chaotic, messy, but honest. She paused, her ears angling toward him with clear focus. You did not buy me for profit or pleasure. You bought me because you could not watch someone suffer. That's simple, huh? Is it not? Elias thought about his sister's face in the dark, about the way he'd clawed through rubble while her hand slipped from his, about 8 years of running cargo routes and drinking himself numb in station bars, trying to outrun the fact that he'd survived when she hadn't. Nothing's ever that simple, he said. Senna studied him for another long moment, then nodded once. She turned back to the viewport, but her posture had shifted, less rigid, more present. The silence that followed felt different, less fraught, though no less heavy. Station Drift announced itself 2 hours later as a sprawling collection of modules and docking rings welded together with more ambition than engineering skill. It orbited a gas giant whose bands of orange and red filled half the viewport, casting everything in rust-colored light. The station's population was a mix of every species willing to operate outside Alliance jurisdiction: humans, Velari, Kesh traders, and others. Elias couldn't identify at this distance. He guided the Sparrow through the traffic pattern and secured a berth in the lower docking ring. The bay's artificial gravity kicked in with a lurch that made Senna grip her armrest, her ears flattening briefly before she steadied herself. Stay close, Elias said as he powered down the systems. Station Drift's neutral territory, but that doesn't mean friendly. Senna rose from her seat with that fluid grace, following him through the ship's narrow corridors to the boarding ramp. When the door cycled open, the station's atmosphere hit them, warmer than Hecate, thick with the smell of cooking oil and ozone and something floral that might have been Velari incense. The docking bay stretched out around them, crowded with ships and cargo containers, filled with voices calling in 6 languages. Elias felt Senna press closer to his back. Her hand brushed his shoulder, whether for balance or reassurance he couldn't tell, and the brief contact sent warmth spreading through his jacket. Her bioluminescence, maybe, or just body heat. Either way, he found himself slowing his pace so she wouldn't have to stretch to keep up. They made their way through the station's main concourse past vendor stalls selling everything from ship parts to questionable protein bars. Elias kept his hand near his jacket pocket where he'd stashed the small plasma pistol he rarely needed. Senna's ears swiveled constantly, tracking every sound and movement, her eyes scanning the crowd with obvious wariness. Royce's place occupied a corner of the commercial district, a combination shop and living quarters crammed with salvaged electronics and furniture that had seen better decades. The door chimed when Elias pushed through, and Royce himself looked up from behind a cluttered workbench, his weathered face creasing into a frown. "Varn, didn't expect you back so soon." His gaze shifted to Senna, widening slightly. "That's a Velari." "Her name's Senna," Elias said. "I need documentation. Full identity package, clean enough to pass Alliance border checks." Royce's frown deepened. He set down the circuit board he'd been examining and crossed his arms. "That's expensive work. You have the credits?" "I will, soon as I line up another cargo run." "So that's a no." Royce shook his head. "I like you, Varn, but I don't run a charity, especially not for—" He caught himself, glancing at Senna. Whatever he'd been about to say died under the weight of her steady amber gaze. Elias stepped forward, jaw tight. "Name your price. I'll get it." 40,000 half up front. The number hit like a physical blow. Elias had just spent 42,000 to buy Senna's freedom. Now he'd need to scrape together another 40 to secure it. The mathematics of survival felt cruel and exact. Before he could respond, Senna spoke. "I can pay." Both men turned to stare at her. She reached up and began removing the golden ornaments from her hair, chains and beads and delicate pendants that chimed as she unthreaded them from the coral pink strands. She set them on Royce's workbench one by one, each piece catching the overhead light. "These are ceremonial gold from my family's lineage," she said. "They are worth significantly more than 40,000 credits." Royce picked up one of the chains, examining it with professional interest. His expression shifted from skepticism to calculation. "These are real, high-grade alloy, the craftsmanship alone." "Then we have an agreement," Senna said. Her voice remained steady, but Elias saw the way her fingers trembled as she removed the last piece, a pendant that had rested against her collarbone. Her markings dimmed as she placed it with the others. Royce nodded slowly. "I can work with this. Give me 3 days." "We have 3 days," Elias said, though he wasn't certain they had 3 hours. Hecate would have broadcast an alert by now. Rask's people would be looking. They left Royce's shop and made their way deeper into the station, looking for lodging. Elias found a room in a residential pod near the environmental controls. Cramped, but private, with a single bed and a narrow viewport overlooking the gas giant. Senna stepped inside and immediately moved to the window, pressing her palm against the reinforced glass. "I have never been free to choose where I sleep," she said quietly. "Even before the auction, my family decided everything." Elias set his pack down, watching her profile in the rust-colored light from outside. Her ears drooped slightly, and her bioluminescent patterns pulsed slow and dim. The removal of her ceremonial jewelry had left her looking simultaneously more vulnerable and more herself, no longer adorned by family obligation, but also visibly severed from it. "You can take the bed," he said. "I'll make do with the floor." Senna turned from the window. "You spent everything to buy me. I gave away everything my family placed on my head. We are both diminished and both liberated." She moved toward him with deliberate steps, stopping close enough that he could see the intricate patterns of her luminescence beneath her skin. "I do not need protection from you, Elias Varn. I need partnership." Her hand lifted, hovering near his face without quite touching. Elias held still, aware that Velari touch was deeply intimate, that he shouldn't read anything into the gesture. But he felt the warmth radiating from her palm, saw the way her amber eyes studied his scars with something that looked like understanding. "Partnership," he echoed. "Yes." Her fingers dropped back to her side. "Teach me to defend myself. Teach me how to navigate this freedom you have given me, and I will teach you what it means to be chosen deliberately instead of saved impulsively." Elias felt something shift in his chest. Not the sharp guilt he'd carried since the mine collapse, but something newer and more fragile. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of trust. He extended his hand between them. "Deal." Senna looked at his hand, then up at his face. Her ears lifted high and forward. She placed her palm against his, her longer fingers curling around his calloused hand. and her luminescence flared bright enough to cast their joined shadows across the wall behind them. They spent the first day planning their next move. Elias spread star charts across the small table in their quarters, while Senna watched, her ears tilting forward with interest as he traced potential routes through neutral space. Her luminescent markings had settled into a steady, moderate glow, what he was learning to read as calm focus. She asked sharp questions about jump distances and refueling stations, her four-fingered hands gesturing as she worked through the logistics aloud. By evening, exhaustion had carved lines into both their faces. Elias offered to sleep on the floor again. Senna pointed out that the bed was large enough for two people who trusted each other not to cross boundaries. They lay on opposite sides with a careful gap between them, both staring at the ceiling until sleep pulled them under. Elias woke once in the night to find Senna curled on her side facing him, one hand tucked beneath her cheek and her ears drooping in sleep. Her bioluminescence had dimmed to barely visible, pulsing faint and slow like a distant heartbeat. He watched her for longer than he should have, then turned away and forced his eyes closed. The second day, Senna asked him to teach her how to pilot the ship. They stood together in the cockpit, early morning by station time, the viewport showing the rust and orange bands of the gas giant rotating slowly below. Elias guided her through the pre-flight sequence, his voice steady as he explained each system. Senna absorbed the information with visible intensity, her ears swiveling to track his words, her fingers hovering above the controls as though memorizing their placement through proximity alone. "Not because I don't trust you," she said when he paused. "I need to understand this freedom you have given me, how it works, how to maintain it." "Makes sense." Elias moved behind her, reaching around to guide her hands to the thrust controls. "These regulate forward momentum. Ease them back gently. Ships like this don't respond well to sudden movements." Senna's fingers settled over the controls, and Elias placed his hands over hers, showing her the proper pressure and angle. She went still beneath his touch, her breath catching audibly. He felt the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of her sleeves, caught the floral scent that seemed to emanate from her hair. Her coral pink strands fell forward, brushing against his shoulder, and he became acutely aware of how close they were standing, her back nearly against his chest, her head tilted slightly to watch the displays. "Like this?" Her voice had dropped lower, intimate in the small space. "Exactly like that." His own voice sounded rough. He cleared his throat and stepped back, breaking the contact. "You're a quick study." Senna turned to face him, her amber eyes reflecting the instrument lights. Her ears had lifted high, alert and focused entirely on him. Something unspoken hung between them. Acknowledgement of the current that had passed through that simple touch, the way it had felt both natural and dangerous. Before either could speak, alarms shrieked through the ship. Elias lunged for the sensor display. 3 contacts, closing fast on their position in the docking bay. His stomach dropped as he recognized the signature of the lead vessel, a modified hunter-killer that belonged to Rask's crew. "We need to move now." They ran through the ship, Elias grabbing their sparse supplies while Senna sealed compartments with practiced efficiency. The boarding ramp was already deploying when they reached it. Elias drew his plasma pistol as they descended, scanning the docking bay for threats. Rask's people came from 3 directions at once. The first attacker rushed them from behind a cargo container, blade drawn. Elias fired twice, the plasma bolts punching the man backward. Senna moved with shocking speed, ducking under a second attacker's swing and driving her elbow into his throat with brutal precision. Her ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds Elias couldn't distinguish from the general chaos. A third man came at them from the left. Elias turned, but Senna was already there, catching the attacker's wrist and twisting with that same fluid grace she'd shown since he'd first seen her. The man's weapon clattered to the deck. She kicked his knee with enough force that Elias heard something crack. They fought side by side through the docking bay, Elias with brutal pragmatism learned in cargo bay brawls, Senna with a ferocity that seemed to surprise her as much as it did their attackers. Her movements carried an edge of desperation, each strike releasing something she'd been holding back. When the last attacker fled, they stood breathing hard in the wreckage. Senna's hands trembled, her markings flaring bright with adrenaline. A thin cut across her cheekbone bled blue-tinted blood that caught the overhead lights. Elias reached for her, checking the wound. "You all right?" "Yes." Her voice shook slightly. "I have never fought before. Veilari mediators are taught to de-escalate, to soothe, never to—" She broke off, staring at her hands as though they belonged to someone else. "You did what you had to do." Senna looked up at him, her amber eyes wide and searching. Then she closed the distance between them and kissed him. It was sudden, desperate, an affirmation of being alive. Her lips were warm and soft, her hands gripping the front of his jacket as though he might disappear if she let go. Elias froze for a heartbeat, shocked, then felt himself responding, his free hand coming up to cup the back of her head, fingers tangling in her coral pink hair. She tasted like copper and something sweet he couldn't name. Her luminescence flared against his closed eyelids, bright enough to leave after images. For a moment that stretched into eternity, nothing existed except her mouth on his, the rapid flutter of her pulse beneath his palm, the way she pressed closer as though trying to merge their separate heartbeats into one rhythm. Then she pulled back abruptly, confusion and shame flooding her expression. Her ears flattened against her skull. "I should not have—" She stepped away, her hands rising to her mouth. "That was impulsive, inappropriate. I do not understand why I—" "Senna." Elias's voice came out steadier than he felt. His heart was still racing, his lips still tingling from the contact. "It's all right." "It is not all right. Veilari do not act without consideration. We do not." She turned away, her shoulders tight. "We should go." They fled station drift with Rask's damaged ships limping behind them, unable to pursue at full speed. Elias pushed the Sparrow hard, jumping as soon as they cleared the gravity well. The transition to hyperspace pressed them both back in their seats, the stars stretching into lines of light before stabilizing into the strange non-space of faster-than-light travel. Silence filled the cockpit. Senna sat rigid beside him, her markings dim, her ears pressed flat. Elias wanted to say something, to address what had happened in the docking bay, but the words wouldn't come. He'd felt her desperation, her need to confirm her own survival through connection. He'd also felt his own response, the way his body had leaned into hers without hesitation, the shock of wanting someone after years of keeping everyone at arm's length. Hours into their flight toward the neutral zone, the communication system chimed. Elias glanced at the display and felt ice settle in his stomach. The transmission origin code was Veilari, from the homeworld's diplomatic channels. Senna stared at the indicator, her entire body going still. "It is from my mother," she said quietly, "Matriarch Vessa." "You don't have to—" "I do." Senna reached forward and accepted the transmission. The holographic projection materialized above the console, an older Veilari woman with elaborate golden jewelry woven through silver-streaked hair, her luminescent markings bright and controlled. Her ears stood high and proud, her amber eyes cold as she regarded her daughter through the connection. "Senna." The matriarch's voice carried disappointment like a physical weight. "Your selfishness has created complications you cannot begin to comprehend." Senna said nothing, her hands clenched in her lap. "The family sold you to secure a treaty with the Koresh Consortium. The credits were secondary. The true purpose was a marriage alliance. You were to bond with Administrator Thel to ensure decades of resource sharing for our clan." Matriarch Vessa's expression remained impassive. "Your refusal to honor this arrangement has endangered that treaty. Hundreds of our people face starvation because you chose individual comfort over collective survival." "You knew he was cruel," Senna said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You knew what that marriage would mean." "I knew duty requires sacrifice." The matriarch leaned forward slightly. "You have one choice remaining. Return to us within 10 days and complete the bonding as arranged. If you refuse, you will be formally disavowed, severed from Veilari society entirely. Your name will be struck from our lineage. You will become nothing." The transmission ended. Senna sat motionless in the sudden silence. Her luminescent markings dimmed to near invisibility, fading toward gray like dying embers. Her ears drooped low against her skull, trembling faintly. Her face remained carefully blank, but Elias saw the way her chest rose and fell too quickly, the way her fingers gripped the armrest hard enough that her knuckles paled. He wanted to say something, anything, but every word that came to mind felt inadequate against the magnitude of what she'd just heard. Her family had sold her not just for credits but for political alliance, and now they blamed her for choosing survival over sacrifice. They'd given her an impossible choice: submit to cruelty or lose everything that defined her identity. Elias reached across the space between their seats. His hand settled over hers on the armrest. Senna didn't look at him. She didn't pull away. She simply sat in the cockpit's dim light, her coral pink hair falling forward to hide her face, while her luminescence faded to almost nothing, and the stars streamed past in their relentless, indifferent dance. Senna withdrew into silence. For 2 days she barely spoke, refusing meals and retreating to the far corner of their quarters where she sat curled against the viewport. Her bioluminescent markings stayed dim, barely visible beneath her skin. Her ears pressed flat against her skull, and when Elias tried to approach, she'd turn away without meeting his eyes. He gave her space but watched helplessly as she folded in on herself. Guilt settled heavy in his chest, irrational, maybe, but persistent. He'd pulled her from one trap only to watch her caught in another, and this time there was no auction floor to storm, no simple transaction that could set things right. On the 3rd day, he couldn't take it anymore. "Talk to me," he said from the doorway. Senna didn't move. Her reflection in the viewport showed hollow eyes and dimmed patterns. "There's nothing to say?" "There's everything to say." Elias crossed the room and crouched beside her. "You're drowning in here, and I can't help if you won't let me in." "You cannot understand." Her voice came out flat, emotionless. "You do not know what it means to be severed from family, to be told you are worthless except as currency for others' survival." "You're right. I don't understand your culture's expectations." Elias kept his voice steady. "But I do understand what it's like to be told your life matters less than someone else's plans. My sister died because the company decided profit was worth more than safety measures. I lived because I happened to be in the right section when the shaft collapsed. And for 8 years, people told me I should be grateful I survived, that I should move on, that her death meant something because it led to better regulations." He paused, letting the words settle. "You don't owe your family your suffering just because they're suffering too." Senna turned to look at him finally, her amber eyes bright with unshed tears. Her ears trembled, torn between pressing back in shame and lifting forward in desperate hope. "I do not know who I am without duty," she whispered. "Velari are taught from childhood that individuality is dangerous, that we exist to serve the collective. If I reject that, what remains?" "Maybe you get to decide now." Elias reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he gently touched one of her ears. The first time he dared. The soft white fur was warm beneath his fingertips, and he felt her shiver at the contact. Freedom is terrifying precisely because it means living with the weight of your own choices. But you're worth that weight, Senna. You're worth more than what they tried to make you. Her ears folded back against his palm in the Velari gesture of complete trust. Then she broke. She wept with her forehead pressed against his shoulder, her fingers clutching his jacket, her whole body shaking with the force of grief she'd been holding back since the auction floor. Elias wrapped his arms around her and held on, feeling the warmth of her luminescence seep through his clothes, her coral pink hair spilling across both of them like a curtain. He murmured wordless comfort and let her cry until she had nothing left. When she finally pulled back, her markings glowed brighter than he'd seen since Station Drift. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but clear. "I need to send a message to my family," she said, her voice hoarse but steady, a refusal they cannot ignore. Jex's encrypted transmission arrived hours later with troubling details about the treaty. The marriage alliance wasn't just about food aid. It would secure decades of resource sharing, technological exchange, and political protection for Senna's struggling clan. The stakes extended far beyond one woman's freedom. Senna read through the data with Elias beside her, her expression growing harder with each paragraph. When she reached the section about Administrator Thel, his reputation for possessiveness, his collection of bonded Velari kept in isolated compounds, her ears snapped upright in fury. "They knew," she said quietly. "My mother knew exactly what kind of man he was, and she decided my suffering was acceptable." Elias watched her fingers work unconsciously at the single golden earring she'd kept, the last piece of her ceremonial jewelry. The gesture looked like prayer or preparation for battle. He couldn't tell which. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Senna stood and moved to the communication console. Her hands moved with deliberate precision as she began recording. "I want to speak my truth." She composed her message with Elias watching from the doorway. Her voice started soft but grew stronger with each sentence, her luminescent markings blazing bright across her skin. She rejected the treaty, the marriage, and the collective obligation that had defined her entire life. She claimed her own path, her own identity, her own right to choose. When she finished, she removed the golden earring, the last connection to her family, and set it aside. "I am not running from my culture," she said, looking directly into the recorder. "I am redefining what it means to honor myself." Before they could transmit, proximity alarms screamed through the ship. Rask's vessel dropped out of hyperspace directly ahead of them, cutting off their escape vector. Elias threw the Sparrow into evasive maneuvers, diving toward a nearby debris field left over from some ancient conflict. Twisted metal and shattered hull plates spun through the void like gravestones. They wove between obstacles at speeds that made the ship's frame groan in protest. Rask fired repeatedly, plasma bolts searing past close enough to superheat their outer hull. Elias's hands moved across the controls with desperate precision. Every instinct he'd honed over years of flying screaming at him to find an opening, any path through. A hit sheared through their port engine. The ship lurched sideways, artificial gravity fluctuating. Senna reached across the cockpit and placed her hand over his on the controls, her bioluminescence flowing into his skin like liquid warmth. "We survived this together," she said. Elias felt the full depth of her certainty wash through him. Trust and affection and fierce determination that transcended words. The sensation anchored him even as their ship spiraled toward disaster. He adjusted their trajectory using the debris field's gravity wells to slingshot them toward a barely habitable moon below. They hit atmosphere at a steep angle, friction turning their viewport into a sheet of fire. Elias fought the controls while Senna transmitted her message and their evidence on every public frequency she could reach, broadcasting it to human and Velari networks alike. The crash landing came hard and fast. Metal shrieked. Something exploded in the aft compartment. They tumbled through alien soil and came to rest tilted at a 40-degree angle, emergency lights painting everything red. Elias tasted copper and realized he'd bitten his tongue. Beside him, Senna hung in her restraints, breathing hard, her ears swiveling at every groan of settling metal. "You hurt?" he asked. She released her restraints and dropped to the angled floor. "You?" "I'll live." They worked through the night to seal the ship's emergency compartment against the moon's toxic atmosphere. The temperature dropped steadily as their damaged systems struggled to maintain life support. In the close quarters, with failing heat and dwindling oxygen, the boundaries between them dissolved completely. They took turns sleeping, watching, keeping each other warm. Senna told him about Velari bonding practices, how physical touch created empathic resonance that deepened with intention and intimacy. She admitted she'd been feeling his emotions since the auction, his guilt and protectiveness and loneliness, and that it made her feel less alone. Elias confessed his terror of failing her the way he'd failed his sister, but that being with her made redemption feel possible. Not about erasing the past, but choosing better in the present. Senna pressed her forehead to his, her ears folding back gently in complete trust. "You did not fail your sister by surviving. You honored her by refusing to let another person suffer when you had the power to stop it." As the oxygen levels dropped into the red, they held each other in the dark. Senna's bioluminescence provided the only light, soft blue patterns that painted their faces in living color. They kissed with desperate intensity, both refusing to die with regrets, their connection deepening into something neither could name but both recognized as irrevocable. A rescue ship arrived at dawn, not Rask, a neutral salvage crew who'd received their distress beacon and the viral message Senna had transmitted. Her recorded refusal had already sparked outrage in both human and Velari diplomatic circles, forcing conversations about agency and consent that had been buried beneath political necessity. Aboard the rescue vessel, they learned that matriarch Vesa had issued formal disownment. But reformist factions within Velari society had offered Senna sanctuary and recognition, a third path between exile and submission that her defiance had created. In the medical bay, Senna turned to Elias with amber eyes that reflected hope and uncertainty in equal measure. "I could return to my people," she said slowly. "Help build something new from what I've broken. Or I could." She hesitated, her ears tilting forward. What do humans call it when two people choose each other repeatedly despite logic or safety? "Love," Elias said. She repeated the word like a prayer. "Love." Her luminescent markings flared bright. "I want to stay with you, at least for now. I want to see the universe through human eyes, to understand what it means to live without collective expectation." "Then stay," Elias said. "Wherever you go, I want to be there if you'll have me." They negotiated with Royce for a new ship and salvage contracts in the outer territories, where species boundaries blurred. Elias realized he wasn't running from ghosts anymore. He was running towards something real. When Senna removed the last golden earring and asked him to keep it for her, he understood it as a promise. She'd come back for it. For him. In the cockpit of their new vessel, preparing to jump, Senna placed her hand over Elias's heart. Her markings glowed steady and bright. "In Velari tradition, this gesture means witnessing someone's truth," she said. "I see all of you, the guilt, the fear, the stubborn kindness, and I choose you anyway." Elias covered her hand with his own, feeling warmth seep into his chest. "You're the first person who's made me believe I deserve to be chosen." The stars stretched into light around them. They leaned into each other, her coral pink hair mingling with his darker strands, her ears soft against his cheek. Love wasn't about saving or being saved. It was about recognizing in another person the courage to become who you were meant to be. Together, they flew toward horizons neither could have imagined alone.